This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. It's tax season, and we're all a bit tired of numbers. But here's one you need to hear. $16.5 billion. That's how much the IRS flagged for possible identity fraud last year. Now here's a good number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it. Guaranteed. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Film Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew, that's everything you need to know about me. The podcast, though, well, we're here to talk, as the title suggests, of the stories of films. So what I tend to do is I look at production stories, development stories, casting stories, release stories, marketing stories, just any little contributory factors that go to making the films that we know and sometimes love, just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to choose for this podcast have a bit more of a mainstream leaning than most, I suspect. Well, there's no suspicion, actually, if you look down the back issues. But they're also films that I tend to be invested in some degree or interested in to some degree. I don't do snark, so if you're hunting for snark, this isn't that podcast. Instead, what I do is I pick two films each episode and I tell the stories of them. Well, the behind-the-scenes stories of them. And to start with, that's just what I'm going to do. I'm going to take us back to 1992 with a clip from this one.
Here occurred the frightening and shocking history of Prince Dracula and the woman he loved.
I have crossed oceans of time to find you.
Ja, Dracula.
There's a sinister, darker side to him I find irresistible. I have never met any man with such a passion for life.
That then was a clip from 1992's Bram Stoker's Dracula, directed by Francis Ford Coppola, working from a screenplay by James V. Hart, in turn working on an adaptation of the novel Dracula by, who knew it, Bram Stoker. Gary Oldman, Winona Ryder, Anthony Hopkins, Keanu Reeves, Richard E. Grant, Carrie Elwes, Bill Campbell, Sadie Frost. I mean, it's quite a cast and a half for this one. We're all brought together for the project. There are two origin stories to this particular film, though, notwithstanding the novel itself. And the first of them lies with Francis Ford Coppola's previous film, The Godfather Part 3. Now, this was clearly a most anticipated project when he confirmed he was embarking on it in the late 1980s, and he started putting the cast for that together, and in a pivotal role in the movie, he cast Winona Ryder. She was set to play the pivotal character of Mary Corleone in the movie, but when she ultimately pulled out of that project fairly late in the day, citing exhaustion as her reason, and that had a knock-on effect for The Godfather Part 3. Firstly, in terms of casting, of course, so that was ultimately the role that Sofia Coppola took on. Now, of course, Sofia Coppola took a fair critical hammering for that role as well, but then conversely, I mean, one of the nice ramifications of a very unpleasant situation was that in turn had a knock-on effect that ultimately led to Sofia Coppola's brilliant directorial career. But also there was a knock-on effect for The Godfather Part 3 in that production was delayed, and there was said to be something of a rift between Winona Ryder and Francis Ford Coppola as a consequence of that. Coppola carried on and completed The Godfather Part 3, of course. It was a financial success. It got lots of Oscar nominations, although I think even the most ardent fan of it would suggest it didn't match the quality of the first two. In terms of where Ryder took her career, well, she switched agencies not long after. So she was with the CAA agency and she switched to ICM. And while she was there, she picked up a screenplay for a new take on Dracula. And this is the other part of the origin story of this project. Because a new take take on Dracula had been commissioned by a production company called Wilshire Court Productions. And the idea was it was going to do a version of the story for the television network in the US, USA Network. And in fact, it was starting to gather some pace as well. James V. Hart had been hired to write the script for that one. He'd go on and do Hook. And in terms of director, well, Michael Apted, Gorillas in the Mist, amongst many others, was earmarked to helm this television version of Dracula. I mean, Michael Apted has made some terrific films on the big screen. But at that point, this Dracula was looking towards being quite a small production. But that screenplay that James V. Hart had written was good, and USA Network recognised that, Wilshire Court Productions recognised that, and certainly Winona Ryder recognised that as well. Hart had been inspired in putting his take on Bram Stoker's story together by the historical figure of Vlad the Impaler, and so he put his story together, and he particularly looked at, there was an argument, I think Coppola made an argument around the time of making the film, that most people don't know half of the Dracula story, that the legend is known, but actually what's in Bram Stoker's novel isn't per se, and Hart tapped into that as well. Winona Ryder liked this script, and she liked this project. Now, these two stories came together when she took a phone call from Francis Ford Coppola, who invited Ryder to his home in San Francisco, ostensibly with a kind of clear the air, but it kind of depends how much you believe they fell out, really. But certainly it was with good intentions and to just make sure that they were getting on, really. Now, Coppola at this point had completed The Godfather Part 3, and he was looking for his next project. He was looking for towards an adaptation of Jack Kerouac's book, I think that's how you pronounce it, On the Road, which would have been a smaller scale production. But at the meeting between Ryder and Coppola, Ryder passed him the Dracula script, and it piqued his interest because, as he admitted in lots of interviews around the time, during his time as a camp counsellor in his teens, he found himself teaching Dracula to students, and so he was familiar with the book, and he read the script and he tapped into the idea of making the film look like something of an erotic dream. Columbia Pictures, meanwhile, well, they were interested too, and they agreed to fund the production of the movie on the condition that Francis Ford Coppola directed. At this point, Coppola was also trying to keep his production company, American Zoetrope, afloat. Now, as American Zoetrope, he put together with the idea of having independent control over his projects, but it had quite a few financial bumps over its years. The Godfather Part 3 had been good for it, and there's a story that goes, one of the reasons that drew him to Dracula is he knew this would be a project of some profile, and it would certainly help American Zoetrope's finances as well. All of these things came together, and as a consequence, he signed up to direct the film. A budget was earmarked of somewhere in the region of $40 million to make it, and this looks like a go project. Now, Coppola had a few ambitions for what he wanted the film to be. Primarily, he wanted a young cast, for instance, and Winona Ryder was clearly the first through the door, and she would take on the role of Mina Murray, Elizabeta, in the film. Keanu Reeves was also sought for the lead of Jonathan Harker. He would get quite a lot of backlash for his performance in the film when it was released, but what Coppola was looking for was just a really young, energetic lead, and thus Keanu Reeves got the nod. The gamble was, at that point, Gary Oldman in the lead role of Dracula, because Oldman's profile wasn't massively high, certainly outside of the UK at this point. Coppola went into the casting of Dracula with the noble ambition of he just wanted the best actor for the job. He wasn't going to be swayed by star power or anything like that. And in fact, one of the candidates he zeroed in on was Daniel Day-Lewis. Now, Daniel Day-Lewis had, at this point in time, he'd won his first Oscar for My Left Foot. He would go on to win 96 other Best Actor Oscars, give or take. But he, at this point, was committed to make The Last of the Mohicans for director Michael Mann, and thus he had to be crossed off the list. Andy Garcia, who Coppola had just worked with on The Godfather Part 3, well, he was also one of those who was sounded out, but he was uncomfortable with the sexual scenes in the film. So on this list of actors were also Armando Sante, Gabriel Byrne, Viggo Mortensen, Antonio Banderas, and Gary Oldman. So none of them them were movie stars. Certainly they've gone on to have a lot of success, but at this point they weren't movie stars. And so what happened is Coppola flew them all out to his Napa Valley estate and put them all through their paces, and they spent some time together. And what Coppola concluded in the end was, quote, Gary just seemed to be the most far out. And as a consequence, it was Gary Oldman who was offered the role. And this was explained in great detail in a brilliant behind-the-scenes article that was published in Premiere magazine in the US in 1992, where I've gleaned some of this information from. And it was, once Oldman was in place, the rest of the ensemble just slowly came together. But during this process, Hart and Coppola kept reworking the script. And it's quite interesting the way they did it as well, that they held stage readings of the script in San Francisco, again near Coppola's home, to get audience reactions. So the only near parallel I can think of that in recent times was Quentin Tarantino with The Hateful Eight, where the screenplay for The Hateful Eight was compromised and someone stole it. And so at that point Tarantino wasn't going to make the film, and so instead he held a live reading of the script with a lot of famous people, and off the back of that stage reading of the Hateful Eight script, so the Hateful Eight film moved on. In the case of Dracula, what they were looking to do was refine this screenplay, refine this story, and to gauge audience reaction even before they'd shot a single frame of film. Coppola went into the production with very firm ideas that he didn't want to spend his money on huge luxurious sets. That's not where he wanted the spend to go. Also, the visual effects in the film would be in-camera effects. I'll come back to that shortly. Instead, what he wanted to do was invest in things like costumes. He wanted to invest in the look of the characters. And this led to some, let's just say, some toing and froing. So 6 weeks before shooting, he fired his set designer, and his set designer was the legendary Dante Ferretti, and he was replaced with the then novice, relatively novice, Thomas Sanders, and he really took a chance. But again, the whole idea was, don't put the money into the sets, which ultimately the studio to a degree overrode. That when the sets were completed, they were majestic and they did look outstanding. In terms of those effects, though, well, because Coppola had such a visual take on what he wanted this film to be, he put together over 1,000 storyboard images of this movie, and he knew that these effects, to meet the relatively tight budget he was working to, had to be done on a practical level. He hired his son, Roman Coppola, to be in charge of the visual effects, and there's some really quite amazing scenes and sequences and shots in the film that just show what you can achieve with a camera. So there's one point where there's a close-up of a storybook whilst another sequence plays out in the background, all done in camera. Lots of little tricks that they used, almost old-school tricks, to realise quite what Coppola wanted to bring to the screen. When they did ultimately get to the production of the film, well, problems soon reared their head. Filming was deliberately mainly studio-based. One of the things that Columbia Pictures wanted to do was make sure Coppola didn't go overboard with his spend. I mean, the Legend of Apocalypse Now lingered, obviously, but also, it should be noted that he'd brought The Godfather Part 3 pretty much in on budget. The delay was relatively out of his hands. But Columbia wanted also Coppola to use more its choice of crew than Coppola's, that they wanted something a little bit more controllable. And that's one of the reasons why the film basically shot extensively, shot in studios rather than on location. And it filmed at the Universal lot, it filmed at the Sony Pictures lot, and pretty much every bit of it was filmed in California. The shoot began on the 14th of October 1991. It would run through till the end of January 1992, but it would be fair to say there were some fairly combative personalities on that film set. Notably, Gary Oldman and Winona Ryder for some time really didn't get on, and this was explored in that aforementioned Premiere article. I'm just going to quote what Coppola said. He said, "The issue was not only that they did not get along, they got along, and then one day they absolutely didn't get along." And he said, none of us were privy to what happened, and it's only really in recent, subsequent to the production, that it's come out that Gary Oldman was particularly intense on this particular shoot, that he and Ryder, when it actually came to shooting, that they just, for whatever reason, it didn't quite click. The Premiere article notes that they say they have disparate acting styles, that Oldman was basically could hardly refrain from playing Dracula 24 hours a day, whereas Ryder was having to put an awful lot of work in just to land her character. Oldman did also say that he was keen to make his Dracula look a little bit more androgynous. He said, quote, "I don't have that kind of square jaw, dark hair. I'm not that kind of Mel Gibson leading man look. You have to work with what I've got." But it wasn't just Oldman and Ryder who didn't get on. Coppola, who fairly volatile at times in his own right, and Oldman also went heavily toe-to-toe. And again, Coppola said, "It's unpleasant to disagree. It's a big $40 million thing, and every argument that eats up 3 hours is devastating to you." And he said, "In the end, I kind of made a compromise." And so ultimately they found a way through it, but those budget constraints were really, really important. That Coppola, even though he had this reputation for going wildly over budget and for excess, actually that didn't happen at all. That there was extra expenditure that came from studio orders, and that's the only reason that the film ultimately cost $45 million rather than the $40 million that had been budgeted. It wasn't Coppola who'd overspent, it was actually the studio put a bit more money into it. Coppola did deliver the film on time, but then there were further problems in the run-up to its release. So he wrapped up production at the end of January 1992, and then this was a film that was extensively tested, and the testings, let's just say they were fairly divisive, to the point where in the run-up to the film's release, the joking title for the movie in the trade press was Bonfire of the Vampires, and that was a callback to the film Bonfire of the Vanities, which was arguably the first infamous flop of the 1990s, the Bruce Willis Tom Hanks movie that had just been released just like a year or two before at that point. The first test screenings then, I mean, the audience didn't really know what they got, and so Coppola made changes off the back of that. So, for instance, the film's narration was added after the main shoot was complete, and Anthony Hopkins came back at the end of August in 1992, a couple of months before release, and that was put in. A new final shot was added at that point too, and then in September, Coppola brought Keanu Reeves back, and a new opening to the movie was put together, and Coppola kept recutting the film, and test audiences, when they saw it, still didn't quite know what to make of it. And so, according to Coppola's own journals, and this has been extensively quoted, he just didn't quite know what he had, and he was going through, he was veering from depression to elation, and the quote attributed to him was, "It just might be a potentially great film, we are on the cusp of disaster." As it turned out, it was said to have been cut 37 times before Bram Stoker's Dracula finally made it into cinemas, and Coppola would say at the time that he was only 60% happy with the final cut of the film. For Columbia Pictures, though, well, it was a headache it really didn't need. That it feared, off the back of these wildly divisive test screenings, that it was going to have a failure on its hand. Now, this was a huge film for Coppola. I mean, Coppola at this point was still regarded as an absolute grandee of Hollywood directors. He was just veering into his director for hire phase that would see over the 90s. In fact, Bram Stoker's Dracula was arguably the first of his director for hire, whereby he would be hired to direct the adaptation of John Grisham's The Rainmaker. He would direct Robin Williams in the film Jack. Films that feel less authored by him, although I'd say Bram Stoker's Dracula feels, film-wise, very authored by him. But Columbia, nonetheless, in spite of the profile of the film, it feared it had a problem here. And so it didn't quite, for a while, know what to make of all these test audience reactions as well. And in the end, it just decided, right, we're going to go with the film. We're not going to do any more radical surgery on this. We're going to put this film out there. And in an era where this was not a common tactic, it decided it was going to target its marketing to try and generate a huge opening weekend. Columbia figured at this stage lots of people would see it on the opening weekend, and then potentially it would be killed by word of mouth on the second weekend. That what on earth are people going to make with this film. And so, rather than doing a platform release where they gently roll it out, rather than targeting any kind of Oscar attention, and when the film was first announced, I mean, it sounded like particular Oscar bait, it decided it was going to put this out as a blockbuster movie, and it was going to go for a huge opening weekend in the era where that just didn't happen. I mean, Batman Returns had opened earlier that year to a big opening weekend, but that was very much the exception rather than the rule, and studios were more patient to get their returns. It thus held a huge premiere in Hollywood on the 10th of November 1992, and it opened the film in a huge number of screens. I think it might have been a record number of screens at the time. On the 13th of November 1992, it marketed the backside out of the movie, and to the surprise of pretty much everyone involved at the time, considering they just didn't know what they had, it generated a massive opening. This R-rated film opened to $30 million of business. And just to put into context what else was out around the same time. So the weekend of November the 13th to the 15th in the US, it knocked Passenger 57 off the top of the box office charts. A River Runs Through It, Under Siege, Mighty Ducks, Last of the Mohicans, starring Daniel Day-Lewis, of course. And there wasn't any other major new movie opening against it. The biggest other new release was James Belushi in Traces of Red, and there's a thriller I wouldn't massively urge you to track down. But the distribution team at Columbia had pitched this pretty much perfectly. They'd found an empty opening weekend for the film. They turned it through extensive marketing and very good marketing into a must-see movie. They'd opened it the week before Home Alone 2, so they got a little bit of wiggle room. And the thing is, they basically got there almost by accident, and as a quote went at the time, had they believed all along that the movie would be a blockbuster, the distribution team no doubt would have opened the movie fast and wide anyway. That basically they managed to turn this into one of the earliest event movies of its type. Quote, the executives simply sat back, let the film do its thing at the box office, and then took credit for its success. And as predicted, the second weekend drop-off was severe. It was down 50% on its second weekend. Just to put that into some kind of context, when Home Alone 2 opened the following week to huge numbers, its second weekend drop-off was 8.1%. Because the onus wasn't so much on a huge opening weekend, likewise, the drop-offs into the second weekend at the box office weren't necessarily massive at that point, but in the case of Bram Stoker's Dracula, that was sizable. So, I mean, also we didn't get it in the UK until January. I remember notably as well, they even put out a making of video. This was way before DVD extras, chums, but there was a separate video release put out for $5 on the making of Bram Stoker's Dracula. I mean, it really was heavily pushed. Columbia almost found a little kind of cinematic universe nice and early by accident here, because then off the back of it I thought, well, what else can we do? What other classic horror literature can we put together and almost package in pretty much the same way? And it was the success of Bram Stoker's Dracula that led to Kenneth Branagh being hired to put together Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which came out a couple of years later, which Coppola would produce and be involved with. That, though, is a story for another time and possibly a future Film Stories episode. In the case of Bram Stoker's Dracula, this troubled $45 million film would turn into a big profitable hit for the studio. It's one that it took over 200 million worldwide in the end. It's one that's still regarded. It's got a brilliant score to it as well, and it just goes to the heart of what this podcast tries to put together. That what you had here was a collection of small little things that all sort of pointed in the right direction at exactly the right time to turn this film that could have been lost, that was feared to be a flop in its runner, into the success that it was. And that brings us to the halfway point of this latest episode of Film Story. So I'm just going to do a couple of quick plugs. Thank you to everybody first who has been subscribing to and reviewing this podcast. As a small independent without a big company behind me, your word of mouth is absolutely vital, and I cannot thank you enough for the support and all the kindness that you've been showing. If you haven't and you wouldn't mind, it would be hugely appreciated if you went to your podcast repository of choice, subscribed, left a nice review. Just these little things make a huge difference to me. We also have new issues of Film Stories magazine. If you want more film stories and in print, we are giving every issue so many new writers the chance to break into writing about film and paying them, as well as lots of experienced ones as well. Issue 10 of Film Stories magazine is on sale now. Film Stories Junior issue 2, which is our magazine for under 15s, primarily written by under 15s, is also on sale, and the same principle applies: an opportunity where people are rewarded and nobody writes for free. As a consequence, because I pay all the writers, I don't have the money to market it, so again, your word of mouth is vital, and I'll shut up now and move on to the second film. And for that second film, I'm just going to dial back just a few more years. I'm just going to play you a clip of the movie. I'll get into the story the other side of this.
Yeah.
Lieutenant Drebin, police squad.
Oh, I remember you, Drebin. What do you want?
I want to ask you some questions. You familiar with that face?
I don't know. My memory ain't so great.
Oh, yeah? Maybe this will refresh your memory.
I don't know. It's still kind of hazy.
How about this?
Yeah, I remember him. I used to see him around. Why do you want to know?
I can't tell you that.
Well, maybe this'll help.
I really don't think I should.
Yeah, you still don't think so?
All right, his name is Nordberg. He's a cop.
He was no cop. He was dealing H.
What?
I'm telling you, he was dirty.
Oh, you sniveling scum. I ought to run you in right now.
All right. He worked at Ludwig Shipping. He tried to push something on one of my boys. I swear it. So what are you going to do about it, copper?
Well, why should I tell you?
Maybe this'll help.
That then was a clip from 1988, quite wonderful, The Naked Gun from the Files of Police Squad. This one directed by Jerry Zucker, written by Jerry Zucker, Jim Abrams, David Zucker and Pat Proft, with the cast including Leslie Nielsen, Priscilla Presley, Ricardo Montalban, George Kennedy, O.J. Simpson and Weird Al Yankovic, of course, who was quite a fan of it all, really. Now, the film of this one came out in 1988, but actually the plan with The Naked Gun was to make it an awful lot earlier. So the Abraham Zucker comedy team, Zaz if you prefer, had obtained funding to make their debut movie, Kentucky Fried Movie, that John Landis directed, and then Paramount agreed to fund their movie Airplane that they co-directed as well as co-writing. Airplane, of course, became an incredible sensation and is rightly revered to this day as a comedy classic. And so off the back of that, they were looking around for what to do next. They were offered Airplane 2, the sequel, but they declined the opportunity to do that film, and they weren't involved with it in any way. I would say, even though some people like taking pot shots at Airplane 2, there are one or two outstanding gags in that. But it's notably lesser than the first film. Now, what they wanted to do at that point was a cop movie. They wanted to do their own send-up of police procedurals and dramas of that ilk. But as David Zucker told Little White Lies in a look back a few years ago, the problem when they first came to do that, and the plan was to do it immediately after Airplane, was they couldn't figure out a third act for what their film would be. So they went backwards and forwards with it quite a lot, and eventually they got into conversation with Michael Eisner, who would go on to run Disney, but at that point he was an executive at Paramount, and Eisner suggested to them that the natural home for this project might not be the big screen, it might be the small one, and that perhaps they should develop it as a TV series instead. He also opened the door for them to pitch it to the ABC network that at that point wasn't owned by Disney in the US, and so what the project at that stage was hastily retooled, and instead of it being a feature film, they managed to put together 6 just shy of half-hour episodes apiece, and Police Squad was born. What's more, Police Squad was and is brilliant. I mean, Joe Dante directed a couple of episodes of it, if you want some a little bit of nerdy pub trivia. But the 6 half-hour episodes that were made premiered in 1982, and the show promptly bombed. As producer Robert K. Weiss, who produced the Naked Gun film, would say, the show failed because, quote, you actually had to watch it. And his point was those who really liked it, those who watched the show loved it a lot. Those who didn't, clearly, they were discovering later, by which point the show had been cancelled and everyone involved had moved on. What happened, there was a point that the point was made that it wasn't really that kind of spoof comedy where you have to keep watching the screen, wasn't really suited for television. Several people have made that point, that you in a cinema you are by nature generally paying attention to the screen, but on television you might be doing a bit of ironing, you might be just walking around. Nowadays you might be on an iPad, iPad or something at the same time. If you're not paying attention, you're just not going to get half the gags. So the ZAZ team decided, therefore, that their next project, they wanted to go back to the big screen. They were happier with cinema, and as a consequence, they started developing and ultimately made the peerless, brilliant Top Secret, which I'm absolutely going to come to in a future episode of Film Stories. If you haven't seen Top Secret, I really can't recommend it enough. Val Kilmer's first role, a brilliant spoof of Elvis movies. The more I tell you, the more I'm likely to spoil, so I'm going to shut up about it. But Top Secret was not a financial success, and in fact they themselves, Zucker Abrahams' brother Zucker, were reasonably critical, really, of narrative parts of that movie too. So they moved on to something a bit different. They went to put together a film for Disney that would be Ruthless People, and that was a hit. But that was the first time they came in and directed material that had been written by someone else. And also, notably, it would be the final time, at least in terms of screen credits, that Zucker Abrahams Zucker would direct a film together, that the three of them would be behind the camera. And afterwards, the three of them went off to pursue solo directorial projects. And so Jim Abrahams, for instance, he would go off to do Big Business, also for Disney, and then he would do the Hot Shots movies, amongst others. Jerry Zucker scored a monster hit in 1990 when he directed Ghost. He would go on to do First Night as well, starring Sean Connery and Richard Gere. David Zucker, though, was at that point, when promotional work was going on for Ruthless People, well, the talk, Ruthless People and Big Business, the talk was he was going to do what became The Naked Gun, that he was going to revisit Police Squad and look at turning it into a feature film. I mean, they said in a big interview in Premiere Magazine that there were several problems of directing a trio, not least one of them being you don't get 3 lots of fee, you have to split it 3 ways. But also there were other stories they all wanted to tell. In the case of Police Squad, then, let's go back to that. The basis of that was a cop series by the name of M Squad that they were using as the basis for the spoof, in the same way that Airplane used a film called 0 Hour that they ultimately bought the rights to, and 0 Hour, Airplane is a remake of 0 Hour. They were that close to it in its style and material within. But M Squad, they wanted something that would take these kind of 50s cop series and just have a bit more fun with it. They wove Dirty Harry into the idea too, and in fact composer Ira Newborn, who did the music to both Police Squad and The Naked Gun, I asked him once how he did come up with the music and the theme to the film and TV show, and he just said he got as close to M Squad as possible without getting sued, that he'd re-listened to the theme, he analysed it, he analysed the instruments being used, put it all through his brain, and out it all came. Even though then Top Secret hadn't made an awful lot of money, although it had broken even, when they took the idea of a Police Squad film to Paramount, they got a pretty instant yes from the then studio boss Frank Mancuso, and they were pretty much good to go. There was a story that circled at the time, around the time of the film's release, that kind of turned into some kind of folklore afterwards, that one of the conditions Paramount put in place was that the team cast an Oscar winner in one of the roles, just to give them a bit more marketing collateral. George Kennedy was cast in the movie as Ed. They recast some of the roles from Police Squad, and that's one of them. And Kennedy had won Best Supporting Actor Oscar for 1968's brilliant Cool Hand Luke. But as it happened, it's just been debunked over time that condition was put in place. Instead, Zucker Abrahams Zucker were looking to cast George Kennedy, even at the time they were making Airplane, not least because Kennedy was in the ongoing Airport series of movies. But at the time, Universal weren't keen for him to go into Airplane. Kennedy had been lobbying to work with the group, and he'd actually been offered the Lloyd Bridges role in that film, but it was ultimately his commitment to the Airport films that stopped him appearing in Airplane. So when the offer to make Naked Gun came along, well, he jumped at it. Leslie Nielsen, I mean, we may as well deal with the casting here. Leslie Nielsen was always going to return as Frank Drebin, of course, and the late, great Leslie Nielsen. Ricardo Montalban was cast as the villain Vincent Ludwig in the film. And what brought him to the attention of the directors was his take as Khan in Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. And that was basically what put him firmly on their radar, and it was a pretty easy decision to cast him in the movie. On the wish list to play the character of Jane Spencer, well, Bo Derek was high on the list at one point. But as Jerry Zucker said, ultimately, we didn't want anyone that had done comedy before. And so what the team did is they went to their conference room, they screened some episodes of Dallas, and that's when they encountered Priscilla Presley on screen. Obviously they were aware of her, but then she just seemed perfect for what they were looking for, and thus an offer. They met up with Presley, realised that she was a really good person as well, perfect for the role, and she was thus cast in the role of Jane Spencer. In terms of the film going ahead, though, there was at least one condition that Paramount put on the team, and that was that the title of the film had to be different, that they couldn't call it Police Squad the movie. And one of the reason for that was the success of the Police Academy films. Now, the Police Academy films, the first one was co-written by Pat Proft, who was a regular writing collaborator of the Zucker team and would contribute heavily to the script of The Naked Gun as well. And so what happened is Paramount, instead of leaving it to the team to come up with the title per se, they generated dozens of alternate titles for them to pick from. As Jerry Zucker would ultimately tell the Los Angeles Times, we picked Naked Gun because it promised so much more than it could ever possibly deliver, unquote. Amongst the titles they jokingly considered were Ronald Zhivago, and then there was a film called Bam Bam. At one point they joked they were going to call it Bam Bam Bam. But they settled on The Naked Gun, and they realised that the other thing they had to do was get a script that ultimately had solved that third act problem, that the issue they'd come up before at the start of the 80s when they'd first tried to make this into a feature film needed some fixing. The eureka moment was the baseball game, that they realised that there were so many different facets to having a big baseball match as the finale. It gave the film a big finish, and also it allowed the finale to come from lots of different angles and left them lots of room for jokes. It was Pat Proft who'd really said to them as well, you need something relatable and big for the finale, and they figured nothing was more relatable really than a great big sporting match that everyone could wrap their head around that. And so what happened, I mean, this was slightly more narratively driven than their previous films and their previous endeavours, and they came up with the ending of the film first and then almost reverse engineered the putting together of the movie, that whereas before they'd gone from the start and hit problems, this time they started at the end and it all fell into place. Paramount allocated around $14 million for the making of the film. And again, a Los Angeles Times report from 1988 that I've just been reading dug into the workings of the Zucker team. That I just mentioned their conference room. Well, that was part of their office on just an anonymous sixth floor office in a block in Los Angeles, which had a dentist sign on the door, and they had a dental reception room that you had to go through to find the filmmakers. But the conference room that they worked out of, as well as having the TV and video so they could watch old episodes of Dallas clearly, was plastered with 5x7 cards that were full of gags, that the wall was full of gags for them to pick from. The whole project was coming together, and when it came time for the shoot, well, that actually turned out to be relatively straightforward. Filming ultimately started on the movie in February of 1988, and it's interesting to hear how the Zuckers have described working with Leslie Nielsen across all of the movies that they made with him. That he didn't really improvise when he was on set. He delivered the script. He understood how the comedy of it worked, and he understood he needed to play absolutely straight for everything to click, and thus he did the jokes that were written down, that he didn't mess around with the lines. And in fact the way that they shot the film was Zucker, Abrahams and Zucker were all, even though David Zucker was the named director, the others were on set, and that the creative forces behind it, the writers, they would be reworking lines as they went along. They tried to keep speeches in the film down to 5 or 6 lines maximum. They wanted it to be punchy, they wanted it to be fast, they wanted it to keep going. It was, for some of the actors, quite an exhausting shoot. I think it was George Kennedy who just said that they were filming the same shot time and time again just to try and get the jokes to work. They were talking about, but by the sounds of it, David Zucker at one point was doing 30-40 takes of certain films and sounding a bit more like David Fincher than David Zucker. And And throughout, they were keen just to weave in references to lots of other films and tip their hats to lots of other films, which, of course, they did. Now, it was no bang on cert that this was going to be a hit movie. That's really worth getting across. That Top Secret, that they hadn't really had anything in this genre, in the spoof genre, that had broken out and hit since the original Airplane. That Police Squad hadn't hit well. That Top Secret, whilst it was very loved, that hadn't gone bananas either. And so, even though Paramount had put this money into the movie, they were conscious that it was going to need a bit of selling to give the film a push. And so what they did is Abrams Zucker, they took the film on a tour of college campuses around the US. They went from campus to campus promoting the movie, screening the movie, doing Q&As, being asked where the title came from, not being able to give a good answer for that. But they put in the boot leather to really sell the movie. And in fact, they did 40 of those screenings going around America, but also they were really conscious that the competition for this particular film was going to be tough. That in 1988, around the Christmas of 1988, there were an awful lot of comedies that were going into the marketplace. So let me just give you a flavour of what they were up against. The week before, for instance, Scrooged had gone into cinemas, along with Buster, which is quite a light-hearted look at the Great Train Robbery. Coming up the week after the Naked Gun 2nd of December 1988 release, well, that was Twins. The week after that, it was going to be Dirty Rotten Scoundrels. Just a week or two later, there was Working Girl. There was also The Accidental Tourist, and it was pretty much a bumper time for big mainstream Hollywood comedies. But The Naked Gun broke through. Not just that, The Naked Gun became one of the surprise hits of the season. It would gross in America alone just shy of $80 million and would finish as the 8th biggest film of the year in the US. Not only a few million behind Die Hard and just above Cocktail and Beetlejuice. And to give you an idea of, again, some of the films that it outperformed. It outperformed A Fish Called Wonder, Scrooged, the Disney film Oliver and Company. It beat Rambo 3 at the box office. The Naked Gun was a really sizable hit. And as a consequence, the conversation soon began about sequels and making more Naked Gun movies. And you don't need me to spoil this particularly by saying, yes, they went and they made more Naked Gun movies. First Out the Trap, so it didn't follow that. It took 3 years to put together. But Naked Gun 2.5, The Smell of Fear, followed in 1991. That one was just written by Zucker and Pat Proft, but with Zucker directing. For the third one, the 1994's Naked Gun 33 1/3, The Final Insult, well, there was a change behind the camera that David Zucker didn't direct this one, and Peter Segal instead took the helm. What's notable about the third film, in fact, is it uses sequences and ideas that were originally for earlier movies in the franchise. But that one, whilst it was also a hit, was the end of Naked Gun on the big screen, at least for the time being, because there were plans to revisit the franchise and to make a direct sequel, a fourth movie in the series. That David Zucker and Pat Proft wrote a fourth film in the early 2000s that was going by the title The Naked Gun 444.4, and in that one the idea was to bring in a young female sidekick to work alongside Frank Drebin, and it would have given Leslie Nielsen one last go in the lead role. However, instead, Zucker and Proft decided that they would go off and take over the Scary Movie sequels that were being successful at the time, and the pair of them would end up working across Scary Movie 3, Scary Movie 4, and Scary Movie 5. I would suggest that none of those films are particularly strong. Now, more recently, there was talk of a reboot of The Naked Gun, that Ed Helms was set to take over the role of Frank Drebin. In fact, just not too long before he died, I had the opportunity to interview Leslie Nielsen. This was back in 2008, and I did say, I did ask him, is there any chance of seeing him as Drebin again? And his answer, I mean, it's just beautiful. He said, quote, "Never say never unless someone asks, when would you like to be slapped in the face with a cold flounder?" we miss that man. We miss that man. The idea of Ed Helms stepping into his shoes, it would be fair to say it did not go down well at all. And that's no disrespect to Ed Helms, who I think has done a lot of really, really good comedy work. But the role of Frank Drebin is so iconically linked to Leslie Nielsen, and rightly so, that it's hard to imagine anyone else taking that role on. It didn't help either that the plan with the new Naked Gun film was not to make it a spoof, that they were just making it, that they were looking to make it more as just a comedy police film rather than trying to capture the style that Abraham Zucker had so beautifully brought to the big screen across several films. David Zucker had a little bit of involvement at first, but he did duck away once it became clear the direction it was going to take. And from what I can work out, that the whole project just seems to have fizzled out in development hell, and I think in that case that's pretty much for the better. Because I think what Abraham Zucker did with those 3 films they made in the 1980s was they really captured something. They were absolutely at the top of the game, and with Airplane, Top Secret and The Naked Gun, it's just a trilogy of 3 quite outstanding comedy movies. I think it's one of those things. I don't think The Naked Gun movie really quite would have happened had Top Secret not gone the way that it had gone. But then conversely, after Airplane, if they'd have managed to crack the third act of the film, then maybe we would have seen it earlier, and it would have all gone down a whole different path. But then that's kind of the point of this podcast, isn't it? To examine those stories and to see those just little twists of fate, those little moments, really, that, as I keep saying, go to make the films that we know and love just that. And The Naked Gun is a film I really, really love. And that has been the latest episode of Film Stories. You can find me on Twitter at Simon Brew. You can find the entire Film Stories project at Film Stories Pod. We're on Facebook, facebook.com/Film Stories Online. You can find a whole host of exclusive video film stories at youtube.com/Film Stories. And also our website that now is bursting with features. It's bursting with news stories. And thank you for all the support you've been giving that. You can find that at www.filmstories.co.uk, where you can also find out about our upcoming live shows, our latest print magazines, and all the mischief that we're up to. And with that, I'm going to wrap this episode up. I thank you as always for your support. I thank you for listening. I thank you for your time, and I'll be back again soon with another bunch of film stories. You all take care. Bye bye.